Okay. All right. So, hello everybody. Thank you for coming today on Thursday with our seminar with Jeremy B. Merrill. This session will be recorded for later viewing for anyone who could not make it today or would like to review the seminar afterwards. We're going to start with Jeremy telling his story, and then we'll open the floor up to questions afterwards. And we're going to moderate it like last time, where if you have a question, just pop a Q in the chat and we'll go down the list afterwards. If you can't take yourself off mute, feel free to type the question and I will ask it for you. So yeah, I guess we'll pass it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks for having me. My name is Jeremy Merrill. I am a reporter and developer, and you may know me from my work with creating the Tabula project with a few colleagues starting in 2013. That's some software that was, I think, the first of its kind as far as free software is concerned that helps you get data tables out of PDFs. And I've also published a bunch of investigative news stories with outlets like ProPublica, the Markup, the Washington Post, Quartz, and the New York Times. My work focuses on using, getting data from various places on the web and off the web, finding interesting stuff and writing about it. Usually things that expose some sort of problem or some sort of really interesting, colorful characters, or explain something about the world. In doing that, over the past couple years, I've been experimenting with how journalists and reporters can use AI and machine learning to help in that process. Just to give you a couple examples of how you might do that, but why don't I just tell you about one project that incorporates all sorts of aspects of this. Starting in 2016 and off and on since then, I've helped maintain a browser extension that people can install on their computers. Whenever they go to Facebook on their computers, it'll send all the ads that they see to my database. We don't collect anybody's personal information or know really anything about the people who participate. We just see the ads. And that helps us understand how American politicians are using Facebook to convince people to vote, to change their mind, or to raise money. It helps us understand scams, folks who are trying to defraud seniors out of their retirement savings by selling them overpriced, actually Canadian coins, or fake health insurance, Trump-branded health insurance in some cases. So that's just a sort of a regular computer programming project, pulling all this data from, making software for people to send us the ads that they see and to analyze them with an internal website. But we also use machine learning to automatically figure out which ads are political and which ones aren't. It's not all that complicated. You can do this with, you don't need any sort of fancy neural nets, although sometimes we use neural nets. You can use sort of old school naive Bayes to basically figure out what words are most indicative of a political ad and which ones are most indicative of a regular ad. So you can just scroll on through ads that are most likely to be political. This sort of a workflow that I think is really useful for journalists or any other kind of researcher, that you've got some giant haystack and it's not realistic to expect the computer to find the needle for you, but it can do a decent job of getting rid of most of the hay, so it's easier for a human to find the needle, to find the thing that they're looking for. For instance, I was just trading something similar with YouTube ads. Get me the transcript of a whole bunch of YouTube ads, learn which ads are political and which ones aren't, so we can then sort through another larger pile of YouTube ads and see just the ones that are most likely to be political. So that we can find various sorts of interesting things and problems. In that case, the data is basically crowdsourced data collected through these sorts of browser extensions that volunteers install. But the same sort of workflow I've used for all sorts of different kinds of public data. For instance, that might be relevant to some of the work that you all do. I've collected, done similar work with corporate financial filings They're called 10K filings in the United States, and I'm sure there's a similar annual report format in Canada. I've also used this, I've also done some interesting work with leaked documents. At some point last year, someone, a sort of insider in the government of Angola, which is a country in Africa, leaked a whole bunch of documents and emails pertaining to a woman who was the daughter of the longtime dictator. This woman, her name is Isabel dos Santos, is one of the richest people in Africa, and she sort of portrays this image of being a self-made billionaire, but her dad was the dictator of the country, and so people had been suspicious for a really long time about where she actually got her money from, and sort of for the first time, all these documents enabled us to trace her wealth and connect her to some of the shell companies that people suspected were linked to her, but you couldn't really prove it. The trouble was, there was 30 gigabytes of documents. This project, I did it at Quartz, and it was in collaboration with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which brought together journalists from various countries in Europe, several American news outlets, a bunch of news outlets in Africa, including some in Angola, ones in some of the secrecy jurisdictions like Malta. And so there were 50 or 100 journalists working on this, but the millions of documents that we had, nobody could read through all of that and pick out all the things that were interesting. And so one of the things we did was use a technique, a library called the Universal Sentence Encoder that went through in using a sort of a pre-trained machine learning model, translated all of the sentences in these documents into numbers, and let people sort of search by phrase. And so if you're looking for documents that are, water bills, we were working on the theory that if this wealthy woman was receiving and paying the water bills for some apartment in Lisbon, Portugal, or in Geneva, Switzerland, something like that, that was a good sign that she was actually the real owner of that fancy apartment, even if it was owned by some mysterious shell corporation. And so people would type in phrases that you might find on a water bill, and the results of this machine learning would let us find water bills in a variety of languages that you wouldn't necessarily know how to search for otherwise. And to the extent that this found new documents that helped us, help the other reporters make the linkages they needed to make and to report the stories that we ended up reporting, I think it was a big success. I'm curious to hear you all's questions, answer them as I can, and learn a little bit more about what you all are working on. And so please ask away.
There we go. I'll turn on my microphone. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today, Jeremy. And it's very interesting hearing your unique background as both being kind of a journalist and having an information-based background through that, as well as applying your development skills to create projects such as Tabula. So an interesting thing, at least what I was hearing from your story, is the contextualization of information, particularly requiring very specific direction for data inputs and outputs to have actual meaningful outputs from your models and such. So my question to you then is, how'd you go about figuring out, okay, what are we going to target this model on, and what are we going to be very specific to using as inputs or using as information, rather than taking kind of a shotgun approach?
It's a great question. A lot of times these are sort of driven by what's available and how much time we have and what sorts of tools we have available, where almost never are the results of any analysis, whether it's machine learning or just regular old, arithmetic, are going to be presented on their own. There's always going to be some level of my judging, does this make sense? talking to experts. Does this make sense? What does this mean? How is this data gathered and how is it analyzed? What are the problems with it? And so in that sense, the analysis is always a collaboration between a person and the computer. And so rather than going for a perfect analysis, we want to go for an analysis that we can understand what it tells us and what it can't tell us, if that makes sense. So for instance, when we're looking at all these ads, trying to pick out the political ones, we're not going to be perfect, and that's okay. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is to make it easier for me to find leads. Make it easier for me to just sort of scroll down a list and be like, oh, that looks normal, that looks normal, that looks interesting, I'll look into it later. That looks boring, that looks boring, that looks boring. Oh, that looks interesting. And then enabling a person to dig deeper without the assistance of the model. Because, AI is kind of a misnomer. Even with all the advances in this technology over the past couple of years, it's still pretty stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And so the key is to, especially for journalists, but I think for anybody, is to use AI, machine learning, data analysis, scraping, whatever it is, to automate sort of the dumb parts and still let the things that really depend on human analysis skills to still let you do those.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah, no, thank you for that answer. I'll pass it off to James for his question.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your time. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your background, your kind of experience, how you got into journalism and developing those two unique tracks. I'd love to hear about your journey, particularly as a new developer myself, and how you got started in the tech side of things.
Sure. I was kind of doing both things separately when I was in university. I was working on the college newspaper, writing, the usual things people write when they're early in university and they're writing for the college paper is like, oh yes, I'm a sophomore. I'm a second year student here. Please read my opinion on international affairs, which turns out nobody cares about. And eventually I focused on stuff that I could actually bring something of value, which was actually sort of figuring out what the heck was going on campus. Writing about where the student government budget was going, how different professors' salaries differed on campus. And I was very lucky in a sense that the university I was at had a scandal where they were faking the SAT scores that they had reported publicly, to make it sound like the school was more selective in terms of SAT scores than it really was. And so I got an early taste of investigative reporting through that. And simultaneously, I was sort of taking a few computer science classes, coding a bunch on the side, just sort of for fun, and began thinking, I'm gonna have to pick career-wise which of these I want to do, until I discovered that there were data journalists who were doing both, and then it seemed relatively obvious what I ought to do. So I took only 2 computer science classes in college. I studied philosophy and linguistics, not computer science, not journalism. But I got an internship out of school at the New York Times doing sort of programming in the newsroom. So the way a lot of news organizations, I think the Globe and Mail is similar in Canada, have a tech department that's basically in charge of the website overall. And there's a newsroom that's in charge of doing the reporting, and they don't actually talk to each other that much. The tech people make a container for words, and the reporters put words in the container. And then there's a very small number of people who sort of sit in the middle, who are programmers helping do experimental, interesting new things. This was true at the New York Times, and it's true at a variety of newspapers in Canada as well. And so I was sort of sitting in the middle, and stuck with that for a couple of years and realized it was not close enough to actually doing the reporting and the writing and the research that I wanted to do. And so I fought my way into doing more of that. And that's what I do.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm a linguist myself by degree, and then recently went into technology over the last year.
Yeah, there's all sorts of really fascinating natural language processing stuff to work with that, you know, in some ways it's weird how it doesn't quite line up with the linguistics you get taught in the linguistics department. The syntax trees computer scientists use are strange and a little bit hard to understand, I think, but the ways that you can use some of this technology to sort of just fool around with language, you know, generate crappy automatic poetry is a lot of fun, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, no, thank you for that answer. I'll pass it on to Matt for his question. Thank you for joining us today, Matt. Oh, audio's cut off. Oh, yeah, it's still cut off, unfortunately.
How about now?
There we go, yeah.
All right. Yeah, every time I switch Zoom to Teams or whatever, my audio just goes crazy. I have to reset it all. Jackson, thanks. And Jam, thanks for inviting me to join as well. Jeremy, I'm from the Delphi group, and we're partnering and working with Jam on a product that we've been stewarding for a long time on ESG insights on companies across Canada, primarily in the energy sector. We've been doing it manually for a long time, and we felt the time was right for us to do exactly what you were you mentioned right in the intro, right? The idea of like automate the dumb parts so that we can focus our ESG experts on generating the insights that add value to our clients, and largely in service of our corporate mission, which is to accelerate the transition to a sustainable future. Right. And so my question is actually related to, like, it's actually two kind of separate questions. One is, you mentioned mining 10Ks.
Mm-hmm.
Are you using a particular, is there like an open source tool for that's out there? Or is that proprietary stuff that you've developed over time?
It's pretty rudimentary. There are all sorts of tools out there for parsing the numbers out of 10Ks and the charts.
Yeah.
But what I'm interested in is the natural language.
Same here, yeah.
And I haven't found anything. This probably is concordant with your experience, but the layout of those things is atrocious.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah. And they purport to have a common structure, but it's not.
It's like 1995 all over again. The HTML markup. So no, I don't really have a great solution at all. I think I'm using some off-the-shelf stuff.
And you're just targeting Edgar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Downloading all.
For those on the line here, Edgar is a website where it houses all of the SEC filings for listed companies in the US. In Canada, we have a similar site. It's called Cedar, SEDAR, and it has a similar format, albeit different.
I mean, that's always the problem with scraping, is it's the same sort of the same set of things sort of conceptually, but the way you have to do it is totally separate.
Yeah.
What I'm doing is just sort of pulling out the text, running it through this universal sentence encoder so you can search it, kind of just as an experiment. The sort of target use case was back in March or February even. The idea was, I'm curious what sorts of companies have told us that their profitability is at risk if this pandemic thing becomes a big issue.
Interesting.
And it was actually successful at that.
Okay.
I was just sort of trying to actually productionalize that workflow and had to put it aside because of the election.
Okay. The other piece of the question was, related to your story that you mentioned of Angola. Obviously one of the big challenges, both from a journalistic perspective and from a data acquisition perspective, from an ethical side of things. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is a British nobleman. And we were chatting about things, and he asked me the question, what country do you think is the most corrupt country in the world? And I was like, I don't know, some tin pot dictatorship something. I said, no, the UK. Are you kidding me? They've turned it into an art form. And the point is, right, it's legislated corruption. They've written it into the rules such that the people with, nepotistic tendencies or access or whatever have their loopholes in the laws, right? And we see this all the time in Western societies. And so I'm wondering, like, how you as a journalist and a developer ensure that the work that you're doing isn't just like catching the easy targets because they don't have the same protections legislated in for that billionaire that, made their money in questionable ways.
It's a great question, and I don't necessarily have a great answer for you, because I think you're right that there's a lot of, just because some sort of bad behavior is, in order for bad behavior to get exposed by the press, someone has to find out about it. It has to be sort of obvious, and it has to be colorful enough to be interesting. And it's a fair point that you could make the argument that some sort of con artist or scammer or corrupt third worlds, exactly like the sort of Angola situation, someone who's plundering from the taxpayers' money in their country, is a lot easier to detect and explain than some sort of really obscure, rigging the LIBOR rate for gold or whatever. That's like boring. The people are really well lawyered, and it's difficult to even understand what the heck is going on. It's a fair point. I think that the best defense there is just that there are, journalists aren't the only system for picking this stuff up. Ideally, you also have regulators in a bunch of countries, and you have a whole bunch of journalists who are all sort of competing with each other to find the coolest thing. And you get a lot of backslaps if you were able to penetrate and understand and explain the really obscure thing. Because you're right that there's a lot of focus on secrecy jurisdictions like Switzerland or Malta that or the Isle of Man or Jersey or something. Secrecy jurisdictions, by which I mean you can establish a company, call it ABC 123 Incorporated, and ABC 123 Limited, and go do stuff as that corporation without it being clear to the public in whose benefit the corporation is being run. And so it could be, Russian oligarchs, could be mobsters, could be someone who plundered their country's treasury, whatever it is, and you have no way of tracing that back. Shell companies are another name for this. Those countries that I named before are widely considered to be bad actors in that regard, but sort of some of the most egregious ones are actually the U.S. state of Delaware and the U.S. state of Wyoming, which are completely impenetrable. They're the only people who can find out who's behind a company in one of those states is American law enforcement with a judge's order. If you want to go out and do crimes, incorporate a corporation in Delaware. It costs like $500 or something. Do all the crimes in the name of that corporation, and it's going to be very difficult for anybody, frankly, to figure out who you are. And it's a problem. It's been a problem for a long time. Given that the president-elect of the United States spent 40-something years representing the state of Delaware in the Senate, I would be surprised if it got fixed. So that's, that sort of just to bring it back to public data and scraping is you can have the best scrapers in the world and the best ideas in the world. If the data is just not out there for legal reasons, you're kind of up a creek.
Fantastic answer, and thank you for all that very unique and interesting insight. It's always interesting hearing like the different perspectives of each on these certain topics and seeing how they kind of be reflected in a variety of different ways where you don't necessarily expect it for the most part. Garang, I just have a quick question and then we'll hop off to your question. But I kind of wanted to hop back for a second, back to one of your other projects being Tabula. So Tabula being the open source software that you had developed for the purposes of scraping. But my kind of more question for you regarding Tabula is, did you have the intention of making this as an open source project from the get-go? And what were some things that you did to kind of ensure the community around the open source nature of the software kind of going forward?
It's a great question. Did we intend for it to be open source? I think so. The way that project came about, there were three core, I guess we're sort of called maintainers, although we don't do a lot of maintaining anymore, for Tabula. The project started in 2013. Me and Mike, two of the maintainers, were working at ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative news site in the United States. And a guy who was, Manuel, who was working as a Mozilla fellow, sort of helping out, a coder helping out a newsroom. It's a program that doesn't exist anymore, sadly, at La Nación, which is a newspaper in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We were both sort of working on the same problem at the same time. In his case, they were digitizing PDFs of, I think, votes on bills in the Argentine parliament. And in our case, we were scraping the data out of these reports that at the time, there were no real rules in the United States for, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you could pay doctors for consulting or sponsor their research or just fly them to Florida in the winter for like a panel or like a talk or something. And in some cases, this was totally legitimate. But in other cases, it was effectively a junket. And the goal of these payments was to get these doctors to continue prescribing expensive drugs. There was no legalized disclosure requirement across the pharmaceutical industry. What had happened was some pharmaceutical companies had gotten in trouble, they had gotten sued, and as part of the resolution of that lawsuit, the companies had been ordered to disclose their payments to doctors. The companies didn't really want to do this. And so what they were doing was they were publishing these gigantic, like hundreds or thousands of pages of PDFs of just, doctor's name, how much money, a date, maybe some other details. And this was effectively useless because what people actually needed was a way, I could type in my doctor, Dr. Nicholas Bolu, Atlanta, Georgia. And so I can say, oh, he's gotten paid by company X. If he prescribes me an expensive drug from company X, I should go get a second opinion because that doesn't seem like that's in my interest. And so what we were doing, and this wasn't my idea, I was just helping out with it, was getting all those PDFs, scraping all the data out, and putting it into a database. So you could do exactly that. And we had built some custom software for this. And we ended up merging Manuel's tool and our tool into Tabula. The reason it was open source, to answer your question, was, well, we want, we have all sorts of friends who have similar problems. We've already solved the problem. Let's let them, let's solve their problem for them. And our first, when we first released Tabula, it took like an hour to install. It had so many dependencies. You needed Python and Ruby, and installing OpenCV was terrible. And it took 6 or 8 months for us to get to a version 1.0 that was actually installable. And our first users, we launched it at a journalism conference. Our first users were journalists because that's sort of who our users were. And there's a practice in the journalism community of, because by and large, the technology doesn't make a story. The underlying data and the ideas and the reporting make the story. And so why not share the technology with other people? Because they're all your friends and they're going to work on similar things, and we're all sort of, there's a sense that we're all on the same team as far as exposing nasty business and explaining things to the public. So why not share it? So that's why it was open source. Open source is a real adventure. We got a grant from the Knight Foundation to support development early on. They paid us a couple $1,000s. We got another grant to hire somebody to help with modernizing some of the underlying Java code. It started off as this like awful JRuby app, and we ported it to Java, which is awful in its own way. And we've got a little bit of, a couple $1,000s in donations over the years. But the myth of open source is that like, well, everyone will help support it. It's a win-win. Really, it's sort of relying on people doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, because it's, there are 5,300 people using Tabula every day. A lot of them work at fancy banks and fancy hedge funds and things, presumably, fancy consulting shops, and it's totally free to them too, which is kind of interesting. But I have zero interest in starting a business based on Tabula, so it's free.
No, that's super interesting. Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. Yeah, it's super cool hearing that, how it came together from kind of a right place, right time, opportunity meets luck, and as the saying goes.
Yeah, absolutely. There, in the past year or so, there's a Python port of the project called like Camelot and Excalibur, that in some ways is competitive to Tabula. And it's fascinating to see their website copy, because they're like, we're better than Tabula in ways X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, great. I am so glad to have competition. Somebody else who's going to improve on this in ways that like I'm not super interested in continuing to work on it. A lot of all of the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and have somebody else sort of come at it with a new perspective is wonderful. And I'm flattered every time that they adopted some of the methodologies and some of the terminology that I came up with sitting at a bar in Brooklyn with our designer, and to see that copied over into a new project is really cool. And I think is one of the, I sound sort of cynical about open source, but it's one of the really nice things about open source is that people can pick it up and port it and copy the things they like and fix the things they think are broken. And that's wonderful.
Yeah, it kind of evolves naturally at that point to become something completely different.
Yeah, yeah. Now we're sounding more less cynical than I usually go for.
Oh, perfect. Garang, you had a question. Love to pass it off to you.
Oh yeah, thanks Jeremy for coming and for the work that you do. I actually know about the story of Isabel, but things to do with data sometimes it's just all about the privacy and the ethical part of it. So my question is, like, especially when you're working on such a huge project that can have like repercussions of life and death, especially when you look at the person that I can say has the owner of the data that you guys worked on. Because I think sometimes like we tend to forget like the source, but concentrate on the outcome. Mm-hmm. But I think we've seen like in the US where the source actually matters. Like the president can go after the source. So like, to what length do you guys go to protect the person who leaked the documents? Especially in rogue governments like the one of Angola, and especially when you're working like with a team of 100 journalists, you don't know the intentions and you don't what someone else can do. So what do you guys do, and how far can you guys go to protect the owner?
It's a great question. And I can sort of speak to my impression of it, but it's something that there are experts on this topic at ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And my understanding is that the source had lawyers who represent whistleblowers in, I think, Africa specifically. It might be all over Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And the lawyers helped protect the leaker and helped get the documents to ICIJ. And ICIJ has all sorts of custom software to let people search through the documents without letting, passwords and two-factor authentication, that sort of thing. The partners are all vetted, and the sort of the general, there's internal collaboration tools that are all very locked down. Security professionals who are making sure that all that stuff stays private. And then it's kind of a matter of making sure that what you publish doesn't endanger the leaker. So I believe the leaker of these particular documents went public after the stories all published. At least before that happened, I had no idea who the leaker was. Someone at ICIJ knew who it was and was able to sort of investigate their authenticity and their motivations, because that's important context. My only recollection of their identity was like they were a soccer player or something. But so that's all sort of, you know, a lot of the folks who were working with the documents didn't know who the leaker was. And when you do publish stuff, you make sure to check through all the metadata and everything to make sure it doesn't expose who the person is. So you know, protecting the leaker is really one of the top priorities, because A, it's important to do it just for its own sake. It'd be unethical not to. And also, no one's going to leak documents to you in the future if your past leakers get in trouble. And
Yeah,
as far as,
good.
you know, as far as sort of the ethics of, you know, journalism has its own ethical practices that differ from other professions, right? Lawyers are going to defend their client no matter what. Even if your client is doing awful things, your lawyer is not going to, their lawyer is not going to say bad things about them. You know, journalists have their own ethical practice, sort of guidelines for ethical practice. And so you're probably not going to see the names of low-level people in the press because it's not really relevant. But if someone is super wealthy, super powerful, a member of a government somewhere, they've sort of chosen to be in public, and so they're going to get written about. And if they're misbehaving, sometimes, you know, things that they don't like to be in public will be published. And if you don't like that, don't be a billionaire.
That's good. No, thank you so much for that answer.
Absolutely.
Okay, so in the interest of time, because we did have the seminar scheduled into 1:45, and as to be respectful of everyone's time, I think that will be the last question for today. So I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, Jeremy, for giving us your afternoon today. We really appreciated the unique insight that you have, and your work experience is something that, like, I feel like everyone in the room could relate to, but especially James, because he comes from sorry to single you out, but a background in linguistics. So seeing your development in the tech space is very, very, it's awesome to a lot of us. And I guess before we cut off, do you have anything else to say?
Thank you very much for having me. It was nice to meet you all. All great questions.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Okay, well then, as for the team, we'll see you guys all this evening for your scrum. Thank you for coming, and I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.